Good morning, Kanye, and all the new people that have found me because of this. Welcome to the shit show. So today was day 3 of George Wagner IV's trial. George Washington Wagner, which he changed his name to, by the way. So at this point in the trial, I'm getting really annoyed. First of all, before we start getting into anything that was said today, anything that we found out today, I'm getting really pissed off. Because a lot of these witnesses are not wanting to be on camera, which I completely understand, but they're also not wanting their audio heard. And while they have every right to do that, it's a little shady to me when the elected sheriff, Tracy Evans, who was appointed sheriff when Charlie Reeder, the previous sheriff, who was sheriff during the rodent incidents, and the Wagner arrest, when he was arrested and no longer the sheriff, this Tracy Evans, who I believe they said was a captain, don't hold me to that, was a captain at the time, was appointed sheriff and then was later elected sheriff. Charlie Reeder became sheriff in the exact same fashion, approximately 4 years prior. Now, that was like in 2020, and later that year, Tracy Evans was elected sheriff of Pike County, and I did still live there at the time, and he was pretty well liked. I'll go off on a tangent about Charlie Reeder when he comes up, because he's going to have to testify, and there's a lot of backstory with Charlie Reeder, and there's a lot of side streets with Charlie Reeder that are, and even Rob Junk, who is the prosecutor for Pike County, he's the prosecutor for Pike County, but he has never tried a jury trial. This is his first one that I know of, unless he's done one in the last couple of years. That's another reason that BCI had to be called in. And then we have the special prosecutor, Angela Canepa, who's coming in. That's the blonde lady who's been doing the opening statement. She did some questioning today, and then Rob Junk also did some questioning today. Part of the day was filmed. Part of it was only audio. There was a Piketon police officer who didn't want to be on camera. He only wanted his audio filmed. There was an EMT at the end of the day who agreed to be filmed and audio. But the first 3 refused. One of which was Tracy Evans, who is the elected public official that later told them, I have no comment about that, when approached in the hallway, asking why he wouldn't say anything. And he was on this scene as his former title. Again, I believe it was captain. Don't get mad if I'm wrong. And I just find that really shitty. Okay, so go to part 2. So at the end of Adam Ball's testimony, he was, of course, shown these evidence photos of bodies in various scenes. And all of the witnesses today, with the exception of the EMT, I believe, were shown the same set of pictures, because they were all basically first responders for law enforcement that were on the scene. So they would have gone in to clear these houses, and they talk about that later too. Naturally, the jury got emotional. There was not a large audience. I think they're vetting out who can go in now. But there were some family members of the Rodens in the courtroom. I'm not sure if the Gillies were in the courtroom, but they were very emotional and held each other. Several members of the jury teared up, which, if you remember, it is mostly women. Not saying that women tear up more than men, but we tear up more than men. The other thing that all of them were asked is what type of shoe they were wearing in the houses the day the bodies were found. If you remember from yesterday, we were talking about murder shoes, which will obviously come up later, I assume. And it's expected now, because they're asking all these law enforcement officers, that there is a bloody shoe print belonging to one of the suspects that will be introduced as evidence later. So they are making sure that they are eliminating the prospect that it might be one of the first responders' boots. Cross-examination of Adam Ball didn't do much other than asking him the address of the homes. The defense's attorney, Richard Nash, has really been bulldogging what the address of these houses were, because where this is located, I'm going to see if I can find a map really quick. Hold on. So really quickly, here is kind of the layout. So right here, you can see a straight line that goes up here. This is Scioto County, Ohio. This is currently where I live now. This is Pike County, Ohio. This is Adams County, Ohio. This right here is where Union Hill Road turns off. There's a big hill right here, and it turns off to the top. Union Hill Road goes this way, and apparently, according to one of the deputies later in the day, or police officer later in the day, the county line splits Union Hill Road so that the houses on one side of the road are in Scioto County and one side of the road are in Pike County. Now, why is this relevant? Probably because they're setting this up to be on the record so that in the event of a conviction, it sets up something for appeal. Because technically, and he's not wrong, by the property information on the auditor's website, the addresses, or at least one of the addresses, is in Scioto County, so it's a jurisdiction problem. Go on to part 3, I think. Now, I am going to work my very best to keep this to about 3 or 4 parts, but there is a lot of testimony to go over today, mainly because the sheriff, the current sheriff, who is at the time was a major at the Pike County Sheriff's Department, not a captain. He testified today, and he was not only on scene, he is the current sheriff, so his testimony was pretty detailed. Second on the stand today, we had a then Pike County deputy named Morgan Music. Chose not to be recorded and was asked the same line of questions. He told the jury how he responded to a scene after being dispatched to an assault, which later on the paramedic who responded said that they were also told that it was potentially a domestic violence incident and an assault. Like the officer from yesterday, he clocked in at 7:30 or 7 a.m. that morning and clocked out at 2 a.m. the following morning, staying to help process the scenes. Really, the only thing that they did with him, there's 2 things that were major. The first thing is he went to one of the scenes, and obviously because it wasn't recorded, I don't know which scene it was. He helped an infant who was found alive at one of the scenes. And judging by later what the paramedic says, I assume that this infant is baby Kylie. Says he handed off the child to EMS and took a witness to the sheriff's office before returning to the scenes to help process until clocking out after midnight. The witness that he took to the sheriff's office, judging by a later testimony by another officer, Dickerson, is that this was James Manley, which, if you remember from yesterday, is one of the ones that found them and was initially a suspect and was even questioned several times. And they went so far as to have a tracking device placed on his truck. He found the tracking device, pulled it off his truck and destroyed it, and caught a charge for destroying police property. Morgan Music also said for the following 2 months, he worked 12-hour shifts to guard the house trailers until they were hauled off to a secured lot for safekeeping. If you remember, I said that they did eventually go out there, hook all these trailers because they are trailers, and they took them somewhere that was debatedly secure or not, depending if you believe that guy from Cincinnati or not, to preserve any evidence that might be in their footprints, because Charlie Reeder at the time said, and I completely agree with him, that had he left them out there at all unattended, they would burn. The Wagners, whoever, somebody would go out there and burn all of them to the ground, and any evidence that was potentially in there would be lost forever. So we're going to move on to Sheriff Tracy D. Evans next in part 4. I don't know. Welcome back. We are on part 4. Now, next to the stand was now Sheriff Tracy D. Evans. And honestly, there's a lot here that I don't really want to just read it off. But really, there's not a whole lot up until he gets to this scene. So pretty much everything up until then was just his background. He chose not to be filmed, recorded, or photographed on the stand, which, again, super shitty looking. It's not a good look. It looks super fucking shady. So when the killings happened in 2016, he worked for then Sheriff Charlie S. Reeder as a major and oversaw felony investigations. He was home when the initial call came in to dispatch for a Code 8, which is an assault. Some of the others, it was later changed to a Code 16, which can be different depending on where you are. I believe they said that a code 16 for them was a dead body. He went out to Frankie Roden's first, was told there were dead bodies. Him and another deputy took Bobby Joe Manley down the road to another scene where there were more dead bodies. That was the home of Dana Roden, where Dana Chris Jr. and Hannah Mae were found. Evans went into the house and he said he lifted the blanket and pillow off of Dana's body and saw she'd been shot in the head. He also said he saw Chris Jr. had been shot in the head and was deceased. Evans told the state that he was in charge of getting search warrants for the properties until BCI agents arrived. According to the now sheriff, he worked with prosecutor Rob Junk's office to prepare the warrants. He testified that later that night, he had his own family emergency and left the scene, and he testified from that point forward he had nothing to do with the investigation. So after the sheriff testified today, we had Major Tim Dickerson, who is currently the director of the Pike County EMA, which is the Emergency Management Agency. They help out with natural disasters, that sort of thing. If you've ever had any kind of like flooding or anything, the EMA is who comes out to help. But at the time, he was working for the Pike County Sheriff's Office, and I do believe he said that he is still on as a special officer for when needed. Basically, nothing that he testified to today was any different than we've heard so far. The only difference is on cross-examination. This is when Richard Nash went in here and was bulldogging him on why that they decided that this was Pike County, and they got into a pretty heated exchange about it, to where Pike County Sheriff and Adams County Sheriff had decided that this was Pike County. Scioto County was left out of it. Scioto County at the time, I just know from hearing things that everybody hated our sheriff, and they wanted nothing to do with it, and go to part 5. I really do apologize for there being so many parts to this, but I never in a million years expected all of these law enforcement officers to refuse to be recorded, photographed, or even just audio recorded. I mean, testifying at trials is part of your job. I would hope that a lot of their reasoning is that George III still has to go on trial, so that maybe he could find, like, they would find out things from this trial. I don't know. Hopefully there's a good reason and not just that they're shady. So sorry that there's so many parts, and we might just start summing these up from here on, but I wanted to make sure that the basic information is out there so that everybody understands what page we're on. So next we had a Piketon police officer who was called out there, Gary Mike Mosley. He chose to not be recorded, but he was allowed audio. So we did get to hear his testimony, and we actually got a pretty good layout of Dana Roden's house from his testimony. So I'm very glad that he was on today. So from this Mike Mosley, who was with the Piketon Police Department, and while this is called the Piketon Massacre, these houses, I believe their address is Peebles. And there's a side note here that Peebles is a town in Adams County, which is the neighboring county. But there were a few roads that had addresses in Pike County that were people's addresses, which I always found stupid because my road was one of them. Even though we were 25 miles from Peebles, I was closer to Piketon. Also, the Piketon School District goes all the way out to the county line on that side of 32, and north of it is a different school district. So this is far away from in town. This was out of Officer Mosley's jurisdiction. However, he heard the seriousness of the call and asked if they needed help. And they told them it was all hands on deck. So he went out there. He helped sweep some of the houses and clear them at gunpoint. So on cross-examination, all he was asked was to clarify some things, and that he did not find anyone else alive other than the children, and he found no suspects. So it's not super clear. This is a screenshot, but this is the map of Dana Roden's home. Way over here. Oh, God, that is so close to me. Way over here, this would have been Chris Jr. This was Dana's room, and this back here was Hannah Mae. He said when he came in, he went to his right, saw him deceased, went back to the living room in the kitchen, in and saw Dana, and then went down the hall to find Hannah Mae. It was not him, but Officer Dickerson, who was the previous testimony, is the one who discovered Hannah Mae with baby Kylie, and that baby Kylie was alive. There was an objection and for him trying to zoom in on a picture to show where she was, but it was overruled and he showed. Final witness for today was Miranda Cable. She is currently a nurse, but in 2016, she was a paramedic working for Portsmouth Ambulance, like I mentioned earlier, in the Piketon station. She was also the station manager who was in charge of staffing, run reports, that sort of thing. She was running with her husband that day. She said that, who was an EMT, and there is a level of care to EMT. So there's an EMT B, EMT I, and EMT P in the state of Ohio. It's a EMT basic, EMT intermediate, which I believe they've gotten rid of now, but if you had it, you grandfathered in, and an EMTP, which is a paramedic. Obviously, the highest level of care is who rides with patients, so her husband was driving. She talks about being dispatched to a possible domestic violence and that someone may or may not have been dead on scene. She arrived out on Union Hill Road, basically found that people were already in the houses and telling her that she wasn't needed because the people were already deceased. She was sent to another scene, same thing, and was finally sent to the final scene, which by process of elimination would have been Dana's. And she found the original medic, and she said his name, but it escapes me right now. The one that had baby Kylie, where I mentioned earlier, where Officer Dickerson had found an infant that would have been Kylie, and then the previous officers, and passed her along to a medic once they realized she was alive. Side note, the picture that they were showing was actually a picture of Hannah's body. And here's another trigger warning because it's super traumatic, but it's important to where the baby was laying because I believe some of the some people were saying that the baby wasn't in bed with her, and they were showing this picture to prove that she was. So Officer Dickerson wanted a picture of Hannah laying on her side. It would have been her right side. They said her right breast was exposed and her stomach, and the baby was laying against her stomach and her right breast. They could not prove, obviously, that the baby was breastfeeding, but Jake said that in his confession that the baby was. But there was a pacifier on the bed laying against Hannah's side that would help prove that the baby was laying there. Miranda was ultimately given a 6-month-old baby to take to Adams County Regional Medical Center, one of the closest hospitals. This would have been Ruger Roden, which was Frankie and Hannah Hazel Gilly's son. He was taken covered in blood and had a ruptured eardrum because he was found in between his parents when they were shot. Last part, I promise. So anyway, I just think it's really messed up that the elected public official can opt out of this, and maybe not so much messed up that he can, but I feel like it makes it look like there's even more corruption, more shade, more secrets going on in the county that we don't need. This is already bad enough. And I don't live in Pike County anymore, but if there's one that's worse than Pike County, it's Scioto County, where I do live. I could go on a whole series about Scioto County, but that's for later. So today the jury heard a lot of the same. Today was 3 law enforcement officers that chose to not be seen or heard, 2 that chose, one that chose to be seen and heard, one that chose to be heard, and then a paramedic who responded for Portsmouth Ambulance, which is a local company, private company, the morning of to Union Hill Road. Up first, we have Deputy Adam Ball, who by now is Lieutenant Adam Ball from the Pike County Sheriff's Office. He was the first witness this morning. He chose not to be filmed or audio recorded. He was a deputy at the time. I believe they said he had been a deputy for about a year. And I'm sorry, I can't come up with another phrase other than I believe. So just don't take a shot every time I say it because you'll die. So anyway, Adam Ball, he talked about how he responded to the scenes on Union Hill Road and declared some of the victims dead. And he talked about checking the vitals of Dana Roden and others. Now, if you're not familiar with the process of declaring someone dead, it's different from agency to agency, state to state. There's different criteria. Usually, though, when there is an obvious death, something like gunshot wounds, rigor mortis, something like that, where this person is obviously dead and probably has been for a while. There's even different protocol for that. So I don't know in Pike County if sheriff's deputies are able to declare someone dead on scene, or if it's only if it's an obvious death, but it doesn't really matter that much because this was an obvious death. Today the jury saw evidence photos of the deceased. There was some stink in the courtroom. That's a lot of the reason why the judge had to address it in the morning, because I guess yesterday they claimed that a witness was accidentally shown when trying to show the pictures on the monitor. And actually today, I don't want to really draw a ton of attention to it because the judge is going to pull it again, but if you looked really closely when they were shuffling pictures for the deputy that wasn't shown, you could see a picture of Chris Jr. laying in his bed. Part 3. One more thing that I forgot to mention, during the testimony of one of the officers, I don't remember which one it was, they mentioned, I think it was Detective Adam Ball. I think he's a detective. I don't know. Anyway, I'm away from my computer. Anyway, he did state that he saw on a shed barn type building that was outside of Chris Sr.'s house. This was the building, one of the buildings that they used for their marijuana grow operation. This building had a door, the handle, and it was one of those kind that you turn down, like the long type, was broken off, and there was blood surrounding it. And I believe they said there was a broken padlock that was laying on the ground. Now, whether this is relevant to the story or not, I don't know. I don't know if it was the victim's blood. I don't know if it was the suspect's blood. I hope to God somebody tested this blood. I assume that they did. I hope that they did. So just in case it comes up later and everybody's kind of confused where this came from, it was brought up today. This is the first I've ever heard of it. So who knows? But we'll see. If you guys think of anything that I haven't covered that you have questions on, I've been following this case since it happened. I consider myself a self-appointed authority on the case, probably for no good reason. And realistically, I probably know nothing about it. But anyway, if you have any further questions or anything you want me to delve into, just let me know.